So Node.js is JavaScript or allows us to run JavaScript anywhere. Now, of course, we can use it to write our own utility scripts, like, for example, a script which stores a name in a text file. Well, arguably, that's not too useful, but you could imagine writing a script that does way more useful things. Of course, you also have methods to read files, to search directories, and you could write a script which automatically cleans up your computer, which creates an audit file with all the files you added since the last time you ran the script, or whatever you want to do. Your imagination is the limit. But it's not what we're going to do here. We want to instead use Node.js to write a web application, specifically a web server, which we can use to send requests to and get back a response. To create such a server, we'll import another core module which is part of Node.js, and that's the HTTP module. The HTTP module allows us to create a server. It has a create server method which we can call, which is of course very convenient if you want to create a web server. The important thing here, by the way, is if you're coming from something like PHP, if you're used to working with that with Node.js, you don't just write the server-side logic, so what you would have written in PHP as well, but that with Node.js, you also create the server. In PHP, that's different. There, you use something like Apache to run your PHP code. You don't do that in Node.js. Instead, there, you use the language or the runtime itself to create the server. So create server is the method here, and it takes one argument, the request listener. So basically a function which is triggered whenever we have an incoming request. This gets two arguments, a request and a response object. The values for these arguments are passed in by Node.js when such a request reaches the server. Create server then returns a server object, and on that server object you can call listen, a method which will set up an event listener for such incoming requests. To listen, you can pass a port number. In this case, I will go with 3000, or actually let's go with 5000 because that's the number we'll use later as well. Now, this opens up a local server on your machine, not exposed to the internet, of course, unless your machine you're developing on is open to the internet, which it should not be, by the way. And then you can send requests to the server under localhost :5000, which is the port number here. Now, for every request you send, you will reach this function, and in there, we don't do anything. Now, before we populate this with some life, it's important to understand that the listen method here will spin up a server, which of course is an ongoing process, which means it won't shut down. You won't be able to enter new commands unless you manually shut down that running process, because it's an ongoing listener which continuously waits for incoming requests. It's also able to handle multiple requests simultaneously, which of course is a must-have for a real server. So with that, let's maybe print console log incoming request here in this function, which should be triggered for every request. And let's console log request.method. The request object is a huge object with a lot of properties and methods. And request.method is a property which gives us the HTTP method which was used for the incoming request. We can also, for example, print the URL which was used. Now, and what we should also do for every incoming request is send back a response. Otherwise, the browser which is sending the request will eventually throw an error when the request times out, and it will time out if you're not sending back a response. Now, for sending back a response, you can use that res object. And there you have an end method, which basically means I'm done configuring the response, please send it back. This method also takes some data you can send back. So here, for example, we could set back some simple text, success. If we do so, and we save this, we can now execute this file again, and now you see what I meant. It doesn't quit. I'm not able to enter a new command. You can always quit manually by pressing Ctrl and C, but then the server is not running anymore. So of course, as long as you're developing, you don't want to do that unless you changed some code and you want to restart it with the new code. So here I will start it and keep it running. And now let's go to the browser. And there, simply enter localhost 5000 and visit this page. And what you should see there is this success text. And that's, of course, coming back from our response function here, or from our request handler and the response we're sending back. Now, sending back just some plain text is boring. Why don't we send back some HTML code? Of course, this is not a totally valid HTML document because I'm missing HTML and so on, but the browser will still be able to render it. So here I'm sending back a h1 tag. Now, if I reload, we see no change. And that, by the way, is a common source of error. If you change your code here, you need to restart your server, because when you run your file, if you run node app.js, it executes that file. And if you thereafter change the code in there, it doesn't automatically re-execute it. So we manually have to stop the server and rerun it with node app.js if we changed the code. Of course, that's a bit cumbersome, and later we'll see a more elegant method of handling this. For now, let's just restart it. If I now reload here, we see this looks like a h1 tag, and indeed if we inspect it in the browser DevTools, we see this is a h1 tag here. So this was sent back and interpreted as HTML by the browser. Now, if we don't want the browser to interpret this as HTML, we can call the setHeader method on the response before we end and therefore send it, and set the content type of our response body, so of this data we're sending, to, let's say, text plain. This tells the browser that what we're sending back should not be interpreted as something special, but as plain text. So if we save that and we restart and reload, we see the HTML tags here because this is output as some text. My browser wraps this into some pre-tags here. That's just something the browser does by default. The magic really is the thing in between. It's just interpreted as text. You can also see this, by the way, if you go to the network tab in the browser and you inspect the request which was sent there. Here you see the URL and the method. And if you scroll down, you see on the response header the content type was set to text plain, which causes this way of rendering it. Of course, we can also set this to text HTML to basically get the same behavior as before, where if we now reload this, it is indeed rendered as HTML, because that is also what we're telling the browser from our server. Now, this is how we can send back responses, and if you're already wondering if this is the best possible way, because writing HTML code like this certainly is not too nice if we're writing longer code, then I can definitely comfort you. This is not the final way of how we will write our code. After all, this is just Node.js. We haven't seen Express yet. Before we see it though, let me give you one other reason why we might want to use it. And for that, let's actually write some code which sends a post request to the server where we then want to extract data and then send back that data to the client, let's say. For that, to be able to send a post request, I'll create a form element here, and in there have an input type text with the name of username, just like that, and a button, create user. Make sure you got your opening and closing tags right, and that button will be of type submit. Now, this is definitely not so readable. I am aware of that. It is all the HTML code we need to write here though, so I'm doing it all in one line. As I mentioned, this is not the final way of how we will do this later. Now, if I save this and I restart my server and I visit this page again, I see this input field in this button. Styling is awful, but it's also not what we're talking about here, so this is fine. Now, if I enter something here and I click create user, the browser by default sends a request to the backend. It sends a GET request and appends the entered data as query parameters. Now, I don't want that default, so I'll set the method to post, which means the browser will now send a post request. It will send it to just our domain. Now here in our request handler, we can now check if request method is equal to post, which means the form was submitted. And then we want to extract that username here and do something with it. Maybe send back a response where we render that username in an h1 tag. Now, how do we get that data out of our request though? Well, first of all, let's create an else case. If we're not getting a post request, then I want to return this content here. So now in the if branch, I want to get the data which was part of the request, because for a post request, the browser will automatically add that username here and the value the user entered to the request body. So I want to extract this here. Unfortunately, there is no request body property or anything like that, which would give us convenient access to it. Instead, we have to register an event listener for the data event, which means we're getting new data because data is actually streamed into the server in chunks. So we're actually getting it in chunks instead of one big chunk. Now, for such a small piece of data as we're having it here, it probably is in one chunk, but that's not guaranteed. So here, I then get my chunked data in this callback function, which we have to provide to this event listener. And I will construct my body here, a simple string, to which I'll now add this chunk. So I'm building up a string. This chunk here will actually be something which we can use as a string. Now, at some point, we'll also be done parsing data. So we'll add another event listener actually in front of the data event listener so that this is set up first. It's not triggered immediately, it's just registered immediately. And there we'll have a callback function which is executed once the entire request body has been parsed, once the entire request has arrived. So once we have in the end built up our body. Now here I then have my body. So for now, let's just console log body and look into it. And also send back a response where I for now have just a h1 tag, which is empty, or which is not empty, but which doesn't have our body. But I say, got the post request. And now with that, let's restart the server, reload this page, localhost 5000, and send another request. Now I go to this page here, which is great. And on the server side, we see this output, username equals menu. So that's what's in my body after everything has been parsed. So here we can get the username by taking our body, splitting it on the equal sign. Split is a default JavaScript method available on strings. This will give us an array with two elements. First element is the part in front of the equal sign. So username in this case. Second element is the part after the equal sign, menu. That's the part I'm interested in. So I access the second element with index 1 on the created array, stored it in the username, and now here we can output the username. For that, we could use template literals or just concatenate a string like this and output the username between the h1 tags here. With that, if we restart the server again, so quit it and restart, and we enter localhost 5000 again, don't reload, just visit localhost 5000 again. We try this one more time, now we see menu here. Now, this is a lot of work for sending responses, and even more than that, for handling incoming data. And that's also the reason why we typically don't want to work with Node.js only. We could do that, but just with vanilla JavaScript only in the browser, that means we have to reinvent the wheel a lot. We have to find a lot of creative solutions for problems like this when we need the data, and therefore it's not what I want to do here. Instead, let's have a look at Express.js and see how that can help us.